I was brought up in the West Country, so the southwest near Bristol. So my local museum was the Bristol City Art Gallery and Museum, which was a general museum, which had stuffed animals as well as 17th through 19th century paintings, and in a way that perhaps that got into my brain as being the perfect kind of museum. A museum that doesn't conform to these distinctions among various kinds of things. Not that the stuffed animals and the paintings were all put together; they were displayed separately. But you could toggle among these things. In retrospect, doing a course when I was an undergraduate reading history at Oxford with the great Asian curator Mary Tregear at the Ashmolean Museum. She offered a course in Chinese ceramics. That was really terrific, and largely because at the beginning of each meeting, it was a small class, she would come in with a little truck, padded sides, with wonderful examples of Chinese ceramics, which she would discuss with us and pass around. And we handled these things. And I think it was that experience of actually handling things that was very important, getting a first-hand idea of the thingness, the tangibility of these things, not just seeing them through plexi. That's one thing. The second, while I was an undergraduate, was spending a summer in the print room at the Ashmolean, working on a print collection as an intern, basically. And that's something that I enjoyed. But I didn't see myself as working in a museum. Later on, when I was early in my career at the Warburg Institute, it's a small place, and I was very friendly with a number of colleagues, including Michael Baxendorf. And he said to me once, he was a very undirective person, he said to me once, "Have you considered working in a museum?" And I said, "No, that's not what I want to do. I want to teach. I want to be I don't want to work in a museum." And he didn't push it. It was only later, a little bit later, that I found out that he started as a museum scholar. And one of the reasons why I think his work is so compelling, is his museum experience. He was a curator at the Victoria and Albert Museum in the sculpture department, and it was only after a number of years there that he moved back to the Warburg Institute and took up a teaching career. But it was that experience at the V&A that led directly to his wonderful book on the alignment sculptors of southern Germany. Well, it seems to me that museums, which are very varied, even as Western institutions, they have always worked in conjunction with other social institutions. So they're never simply separate or somehow apart. So they're always responding in one way or another to social pressures and expectations. And I think the set of social pressures and expectations on many museums now in many parts of the world are a little different from what they might have been 100 years ago. And probably what you have to do is follow the money to try to understand what some of those pressures might be. Museums have mission statements, they have understandings that they articulate within themselves as to what they're supposed to be doing, but they're also subject to the pressures from funding sources. And one of the ones that I think is most noticeable now, that is not, I would say, causing some kind of crisis, but a certain amount of change in practice, is what I think you can sum up as social relevance. How can any given museum serve a variety of constituencies, those constituencies being very varied, and at least a number of those constituencies being not exactly what you might think of in a normative sense as being scholarly constituencies. And this can go in the direction of competition with neighbouring forms of institutions that are offering forms of entertainment. So is there now an increasing pressure on museums, first of all, to serve a wider social set of constituencies in ethnic, class terms? Is there an increasing expectation for museums to entertain? And I think that those are things that are really pressure points, if you like. Well, my entire museum career was at a particular kind of museum which is embedded within a university. So this was at the Fogart Museum at Harvard University. And so our principal constituency was within the university. And the idea was that what the Fogart Museum might do could be, as it were, inadvertently of interest to others, rather than having to serve a wide range of constituencies in the way that a public museum does. So that's the first sort of constraining factor. Having said that, I think it's very important insofar as an institution like the Fogart Museum is a place where future museum professionals and museum scholars are receiving some of their education, that they should get an idea of what serving a wider constituency might actually entail. So I think it's really important that a museum such as that would also serve K through 12 kids, would serve elders, would serve communities or parts of communities that might be disadvantaged in some way, as well as working within the university with a principally student and faculty set of users. I'd like to say just a little bit about an exhibition project that was embedded in the curriculum at Harvard called Tangible Things, which grew out of work that I did over a 10-year period with my historian colleague Laurel Thatcher Ulrich. And one of the reasons that I want to I'll say a little bit about this is because the kind of things that we worked with the choices we made were the result of thinking about the nature of these institutions, of museums. I really do strongly believe that museums should take themselves as objects of study, not simply in the sense of working with their collections, which of course they do, but what are we doing with these collections? A sort of self-reflective practice. And this project was in part a result of thinking along those lines. So what we did with this was to look at categorization, think about how things that have been collected have been categorized first into different kinds of museums, whether they're history museums, science museums, art museums, natural history museums, and then within those. So how does this help people to make sense of things in the world and the relationship between these things that are collected and the rest of the world? So that's what we were trying to explore with this. And this is a complex project, not only in terms of the ideas that underlie it, because you very quickly get into the realms of philosophy, but also just in practical terms, that these constituent institutions of Harvard University, which has nearly 50 collections of things, those collections really don't have very much to do with each other, and they are institutionally, administratively distinct from one another. So how do you do something that actually crosses these boundaries? And that was the major challenge. I think for very understandable reasons, this is not a way of thinking that many people who are working in museums participate in or buy into. And I think that's perfectly understandable. Most people who work in museums, whether in curatorship or other areas such as conservation, they don't have the leisure, which I mean in a positive sense, or the pressure on them to think about the nature of their institutions. So, because they work incredibly hard just staying still. I mean, these are high-pressure places. We don't think of museums as being high-pressure places, but they are. So I think there aren't that many people in museums who really think along these lines broadly. There are definitely some, but there is a resulting tension, I think, between scholarship in museums and scholarship in other kinds of institutions, particularly universities and colleges. And that tension is can sometimes be quite antagonistic, and I think that's a great shame. Mm-hmm. There's definitely two cultures of scholarship. I don't regard an exhibition as an end product. I think many people in museums do, and for perfectly good reasons. I see an exhibition as being inherently experimental, mm-hmm. As being the only way in which, when I'm doing this, I can work out certain ideas. Mm-hmm. That the only reason for doing an exhibition is in order to work on these ideas because there's no other way of doing it. Mm-hmm. And for me, there's no other reason to do an exhibition. I'm not saying there's no other reason for others to do exhibitions, but for me, that's mm-hmm. the case. So these are projects that are to do with process, and there is no end product. There will just be another step that will follow. For instance, with the Tangible Things project that I mentioned a little earlier, we had this complex exhibition, and the publication is following after the exhibition because we couldn't do a publication without having done the exhibition. So that seems to me to be the right way around, rather than producing a catalogue that is made available at the same time as the exhibition. I also would like to maybe introduce at this point the idea that exhibiting is not the only thing that museum curators do. Mm-hmm. Exhibiting both long-term, what's sometimes called permanent, nothing's permanent, mm-hmm. but long-term exhibits and temporary exhibitions are just maybe among the most visible things that scholars in museums do, but they're by far not the only things, mm-hmm. Nor should they be. And that's, I think, particularly true in those institutions where there's a continuing tradition of innovative scholarship. And that's probably more the case in natural history museums than art museums now, because I think natural history museums still fulfill an important role in taxonomic scholarship, which is still, as we are, as a society or societies, grappling with the nature of genomics. This is a lot of this work is being done in museums. Mm-hmm. One ideal in museum practice is constantly to rearrange the long-term exhibits, mm-hmm. so that you see things in a variety of combinations that are not necessarily the ones that are familiar. And some institutions have tried this, and it often leads to really fascinating results, not always critically applauded. I'm thinking of Nicholas Sirota's relatively early days at the Tate. I think this can be extremely helpful because no one thing shows all of itself in any one set of circumstances. Mm-hmm. And there are infinite ways of rearranging things to bring out the characteristics that they might be able to exhibit in a variety of circumstances. However, it's very time-consuming and very expensive. So our curators and other museum professionals, is their time best spent doing this? And maybe it isn't. Maybe it's just as well to do this not to have things permanently, but to have things move at a slower pace and then be able to invest the time, which after all is limited, in other forms of museum practice, including other forms of exhibiting. I don't think there's a one answer to this for all institutions, but I think the basic principle that it isn't inevitable that you should see what you are shown in the way in which it is being shown to you is extremely important. Visitors are deliciously unpredictable, and however much you want to try to direct visitors by arranging things in an exhibition space so as to more or less oblige them to follow a particular path so that your argument is clear, they're going to subvert it. They're going to go in the other direction. And I think that's something that we shouldn't wring our hands about. We should actually embrace that and say, well, they're going to look at this in their own way. They have their own agendas. They have their own sets of ideas, and they may be quite inchoate, unrealized, but that's fine. They're exploring. You create a space as a curator with things for people to explore, and they're going to explore that in a variety of ways. So, but having said that, of course, you as a curator of an exhibition are making choices that, to a greater or lesser extent, are directive, because it's a discursive form. So you do hope that some kind of argument comes across. I think scholarship in museums is very difficult to realize in any other than a very local sense. And it's in part because I really do believe that the epistemological model that led to the formation of museums in the 19th century has, to a large extent, dissipated. And we now follow a different set of epistemological concerns. And they are much more to do with the immaterial and the abstract than was the case when there was this firm belief that we could understand the world by examining its parts. There's still a continuation of the sense that, yes, there are certain things that we can learn by examining parts of the world, and including those parts of the world that we can bring into a museum. But it's as though those big questions, the big ideas, are now beyond the reach of museum scholarship. And I think this is just a set of circumstances we have to take into account. And it leads me to wonder, well, are museums capable of reinvigoration to be able to deal with big ideas? So a question that I've asked before is, who was the last museum curator to win a Nobel Prize? And that question takes people by surprise. How would you expect any museum curator to win a Nobel Prize? Well, it was in the early 1900s, and it was, I think it's Henri Becquerel, who was at the Musée National de l'Histoire Naturelle in Paris, who shared the Nobel Prize with the Curie. And why is it that this no longer happens? It's because museums do not deal in big ideas. And so sometimes I'm kind of almost despairing about the possible future of museums of every kind, as sites of scholarship. Because if you're not dealing with big ideas or have those ambitions, why bother? However, it does seem to me that we are having a kind of a reinvigoration of an investment in things, in the tangible aspects of the world, in relation to their immaterial constituents. So that this distinction, even the distinction between materiality and immateriality, is problematized. And I think this is where museums can come back into the picture. But it's not straightforward. I think I've been very fortunate in having been able to spend 20 years at an institution that at least tacitly tolerated the kind of inquiry that I'm interested in doing. I won't say that it's necessarily that it was always 100% supportive, but no institution is always 100% supportive of what people who work in it want to do. But at least I was able to do that, and it's partly by having a kind of dual identity as a museum scholar, as a curator, and as a history faculty teacher. And I think a large part of what I've done has been to negotiate negotiate a relationship between those two things, and never to be content with being just one. But given that you have fewer constraints as a faculty member than you do working within a museum, whatever kind of museum, because museums are totally dependent on teamwork. Given that you have fewer constraints as a faculty member, I am very glad to have now changed that balance and be principally a teacher rather than principally a curator. I'd like to begin with this extremely challenging area of thinking by questioning this assumption that when something enters a museum, it's there for keeps, it's there forever. That is the case according to the terms of accession of many museums, that expectation. But we now know through a variety of practices that this is not necessarily the case. So, for instance, in some countries, including ours, things can be deaccessioned. Not from every museum, but from many museums. So you can then begin to think about these things that are within museums that seem to be withdrawn from circulation as being not former commodities, if you like, but dormant. So I prefer to think of things in museums as being dormant commodities, insofar as they're open to exchange. So that's the first thing. The second is the impact of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, and the numbers of things that have left museums to be returned to the communities from which they came, which I think is a highly positive development. And not only highly positive because of the impact that this can have on indigenous communities, but also the impact that this can have on the relationship between indigenous communities and museums. It can be very positive. So, for instance, thinking not of a spear, but of various dance regalia, I followed a group of dance regalia that was repatriated by the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at Harvard to the Hooper tribe of California, and visited the elder who was responsible for looking after this regalia that had been returned, and saw the pieces that had been returned, and we had it was a wonderful visit. But that, I think, really brings up the idea that things are not necessarily stuck in museums. They can have a life within communities that we may not even foresee. And why can't we think in terms of things coming in and going out, and maybe the same things crossing this boundary? There's a lot in museum culture that goes against that. The whole ritual of accessioning and turning the thing that one day you're going to be handling without a second thought into something that then you have to wear gloves in order to touch, if you can touch it at all. There is a practical side to this, but there's also a ritual side to this. And I think we might conceive of institutions in the future where the boundaries between collections and the outside is much more permeable. This is an adaptation of a concept that one of my close collaborators, I love collaborative work, Anne Eaton at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and I have developed from the thought of one of my old colleagues and acquaintances at Harvard, Stephen Jay Gould, who applied this, or developed this idea of exaptation in zoology, basically. So how a thing or part of a thing can be, can change its function without significantly necessarily changing its form. If you think of the wing of a penguin, originally designed for flight, its exaptation is designed to swim. So one of the things that I think that we are trying to get at with appealing to this concept is the radical instability of things. Mm-hmm. And things continually change, their uses are continually changed, their forms can continually change, whether inadvertently or purposefully. And one of the radical changes of use of any given thing is when it leaves the rest of the world to enter a museum. That's a huge change of use. So can we think of this in terms of exaptation? So I'm not saying that this is a concept that can be universally applied, but it's just to draw our attention to to instability and adaptability and change. I don't consider myself an art historian. I consider myself, my core discipline is history, and there's a big difference between history and art history, it seems to me, which we might talk about if you want to, but that's the first thing. So art history is not front and center in my mental life, although of course it's a constituent. But philosophy I take to be a set of practices that is very broad. And in the Western sense of this practice, since the 1920s, there's been what Michael Frieden called a parting of the ways between continental philosophy, following Heidegger, and analytical philosophy, following Carnap. And it was this debate between Heidegger and Cassirer in 1929 that has been identified as this watershed, this parting. Now, within philosophical practice, broadly speaking, there's been such an antagonism between these two ways of approaching intellectual puzzles. And it seems to me that it's a question of tools. We think up puzzles for ourselves, or we're confronted with puzzles. How are we best going to try to answer these? And if we only use one set of tools, or tools from one part of the box, we're going to be at a terrific disadvantage compared with those of us who can draw on the full set. And it seems to me that if we can encourage forms of practice in which, yes, you can draw on Adorno, but you can also draw on Austin. Yes, you can draw on Heidegger, but you can also draw on Richard Wollheim. This seems to give you a potential advantage, if you like. I don't mean in a sort of competitive sense. I just mean we are going to be in a better position to deal with these puzzles. And so the work that I did with Salim Kamal on a series of 10 books called Cambridge Studies in Philosophy and the Arts, we would purposefully invite thinkers from both of these traditions and from other disciplines to apply their ways of thinking to a shared puzzle. And I think that was fairly unusual in the 90s to have someone like Jean Baudrillard in the same volume as Terry Diffie. This just didn't happen elsewhere because the critical theorists were drawing almost exclusively on continental work and discounting an entire way of thinking which can actually be very efficacious. So I'm not taking sides in this. I'm saying let's see what we can use from any direction that could be useful. All I can claim to do is to try to do my bit to understand the relationship between the human present and the human past, and how people and peoples respond to or respond to one another as mediated by tangible things. History is going to be constantly redone. We never finish with history. There is no end to history, because it is as much about the present as it is about the past. And that's a difficult relationship to try to grasp. So however we might among us go about this, and different people will go about this in different ways, those that help us to do this in a way that means that we might enhance our understanding, not only of what happened in the past, but how we're behaving now, those are things that I think are really worth pursuing. It's very tricky when you try to describe or get some kind of an understanding for yourself of relationships among disciplines now and among interdisciplines. Things have become sort of wonderfully mixed up, in a sense, to good purposes. And this is because people are asking ever new questions and finding that the traditional disciplinary ways of addressing these questions is not always adequate to the task. So you draw on these other disciplines. However, I consider, as I think I've said already, my core discipline is history. And history is famously a magpie discipline. And I feel that as an historian, I've become accustomed to picking things from other disciplines that can help me to function as a historian. And that's something that I think I witnessed historians doing this when I was a graduate student, and seeing how that could help and how that could work. So I would align my own forms of thinking, if you like, not so much with visual studies as it's constituted in various institutions, such as your own, which I respect greatly, and I think this is a wonderful set of ways of going about things, but more in a affiliation that draws from, it sounds incredibly dull, and maybe it is, from Oxford history. And those historians, in this set of practices that was fostered at Oxford from the 50s, that drew on traces of the past that were non-written. And I'm thinking of people like K.B. McFarlane and Richard Cobb, by whom I was taught at Oxford, who draw on these resources that are not necessarily manuscript or written sources. The way that I've been thinking about this whole field of, if you like, artists' interventions in museums is to think, well, what is happening here institutionally? And what's happening is that artists have a particular sanction to intervene in ways that no one else does, because they're artists. And that gives what they do a certain standing. And this is wonderful. Some of the work of this kind, the examples that you gave, I never saw Broadhouse's work in the late 60s, but this is a fascinating form of practice, which I'm very, very happy to see happen, and I think it can be extremely productive when an artist comes in and does something that perhaps no one else might do. What I'm hoping might happen, though, is, and this is at a tangent to your question, but I think it's addressing it in a particular way, is that this kind of practice need not be confined to artists. And why aren't curators behaving more like this and being much more expansive in the ways in which they deal with things? It doesn't have to be an artist who uses things in collections in a way that usually doesn't happen. It can be other people who do this. And I think if others, including curators, but not confined to curators, expand their practice along these and other lines, then the kind of expectations that many people might have of what they might find in a museum will change. And it'll become much more unpredictable and much more exciting intellectually and viscerally. So artists can set us an example, but I hope that that example can be taken up by others. Not by others who behave like sort of wannabe artists, but that some of these tactics that artists have used, they're open to others as well.